What is initiation? What is culture? What skills and tools do we need during a time of transition? This is Darren Silver, and welcome to The Return.
Welcome everyone to the Return podcast. Today we have Karl Direske, head teacher and founder of Wilderness Fusion. He is also a teacher of mine. I'm really grateful he is on the podcast today and excited to have a wonderful conversation with him. Karl, how's it going today?
Really well, Darren. Hoping to have some fun.
Right on. Fun sounds good to me. So, Karl, I'm curious if you can share a little bit about your journey to becoming a healer and a teacher.
Yeah. So, my journey began when I was in my 20s. I started to learn from a woman named Barbara Brennan, and this is back in the early 90s. You had two choices to become a healer in the 90s. On the East Coast, we had on the East Coast we had Barbara Brennan. I was on the East Coast, so I studied with Barbara. You also had Rosalind Briere on the West Coast. So started studying with Barbara, which was a natural fit because I had gone to engineering school. I was building high rises at the time, and she was a physicist. She was a NASA physicist who got into healing. So that science piece helped pull me into the healing realm. And then once I got into it, I started to understand it, and I realized the limitations of the framework that we were learning at that juncture. So I was looking for something else, and I found a man named Tom Brown Jr. Not a natural fit for me. When I first met Tom, I was like, this is the we'll make this a simple thing. He wasn't the easiest teacher, and I really disliked him when I first met him at something called a standard class. And it wasn't until the last day when he did a sweat lodge that I actually shifted my perspective on the man. And I realized I needed to study with him. Ultimately, because I wanted to take some classes with Tom at the end of the 90s, I ended up not being a teacher at Barbara Brennan anymore, shifting to being a student of Tom's for the next 15 years until he asked me to run his tracking school. And he tricked me into starting Wilderness Fusion, which is our healing school. The story goes this way, is he came to me over and over again and said, you and I are going to teach a class together. And I said, Tom, I'm not teaching a class with you. I never wanted to be Tom's competition. But finally, he's pretty persistent, and I said, fine, we'll do a class together. So we were doing one of his intensive classes that would happen 4 times a year over a weekend. And
Was this
after the class filled,
was this a Keepers? What was called the Keepers?
it was under the Keepers
Sure.
umbrella, and it was called Healing One, interesting enough. So, well, actually, it wasn't under the Keepers umbrella. He used to do intensives every weekend, right, between his classes. So the Keepers actually came later when I was, well, actually before, when I was running tracker school. How that came about is a whole interesting story in itself, because you're in 2009, and the economy had crashed, and you make things work. So that's where Keepers classes actually came from. But this slightly predated that. We, once the class filled, he came back to me and said, "I'm not teaching the class, you are, this Healing One class." And so I used to tell the story on intros when we were doing intros for Wilderness Fusion that I asked the registrar at the time to call everyone and tell them that Tom wasn't going to be there and they could have their money back. On one of those calls, somebody said, Sarah, the registrar at the time, didn't call. You called us each. And they all ended up coming. All 22 students came to that first class. After the first weekend, they said to me, a weekend's not going to be, or 4 weekends are not going to be enough. We want more. And a 7-year school is born. But, is that my healing journey? There are a lot of details not in that story, but that's basically the logistics of it. Is I never thought I was going to be a healer. I'm building high rises at the time. I'm what's known as the suit. I'm the guy who makes sure that all those 1,000 to 2,000 men are all going up the building at the same time. And here I find myself at Barbara Brennan, because I would find hour gaps in my schedule when my ex-wife was taking those classes. So I was like, how could this be? And then I met Barbara, and she was a great teacher. She just recently died. So did Tom. So yeah, she was an incredible teacher, and it was a really great inroad to me to the healing realms. I had a really great time when I was at Barbara Brennan. We had, when I was a teacher there, we had over 1,200 students. Yeah, Barbara knew how to do things at a scale. So yeah, it was a pretty incredible experience. And, stepping into the world of Tom Brown was the polar opposite of that. Tom is a very difficult teacher for many, for most. Somehow, of all the work I had done at Barbara Brennan, Tom's contradictions actually made a lot of sense to me. I didn't really understand the contradiction until after I left and started teaching the work on my own. But if you're going to have a choice, right, which is what the tracker school was really the center of it, is something called Naya 2, which is the philosophy of choice. So if you're going to have a choice, there has to be a contradiction. If it's just white, you don't have a choice. If it's just black, you don't have a choice. But somehow, as soon as there's this contradiction, you have a choice of the road you're going to take. And the more I learned about that, the more I started teaching about contradiction and giving people inroads into the contradiction of it all. And it's one of the focal points of what we teach at Wilderness Fusion. Wilderness Fusion itself is 99% the teachings that Tom passed on to me. Okay, and I say to me, I mean, he passed these teachings on to many people. But when I was running the tracker school for those 4 or 5 years, he and I would speak 4 or 5 times a day, and not just during the week, Saturdays, Sundays. There was no such thing as a holiday working with Tom. So for 5 years, we always we laugh, anybody who's worked there, and you say you worked there, and it was dog years. Every year was 7 years. And it really was working with Tom. Tom kind of, if you wanted to learn something, he made it hard on you. So you really had to be motivated to learn from him. So there's many things that he taught me. He perhaps taught them to other people as well. I'm not suggesting it was exclusive, but he was grooming me to teach this healing piece all along.
Hearing this story, I was curious about that. Like, do you feel like he was intentionally preparing you to ultimately have wilderness fusion, although he may not have known the container of it, but that he was really intentional?
He actually insisted upon it. Okay. I mean, he not only tricked me into doing it, but he basically kind of edged me out the door and said, "You need to start your own school." And Did he tell me how to teach this? He surely didn't. He's Tom Brown. He didn't hand me that manual and say, here's how you teach it. But I think it was after I taught the first Healing 2 class, he came to me and said, okay, how are you teaching this? And so we had a long conversation about how I was teaching at that juncture. And he said, okay, I get it. You're teaching a scout shaman path. Okay. And that made no sense to me in that moment. It took me years to unpack that teaching. But what he also said to me is, so you're going to teach a 5 to 7 year course curriculum. And I said, yeah, no, like, 2 classes isn't enough, 3 classes, perhaps, maybe 4 years, but 5 made no sense with the numerology, if you will, that sat behind everything that he had taught us. 5 just wasn't a thing. And did I really want to teach a 7 years linear school where you went from healing 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, et cetera? It wasn't appealing to me. Ultimately, it is a 7 year school. And once you start healing 5, you're really signing up for healing 5, 6, and 7. So 5, 6, and 7 really one course material. In some ways, they are. So he basically he understood where I was headed better than I did at that juncture. Yeah.
Yeah, it's powerful for me to hear you share that it was in the sweat lodge that there was a perspective shift. My first class with Tom, it was at the farm. Um,
Yeah.
so we're talking 2002, 2003, somewhere around there.
Yeah. Some of those last years
Yeah,
at the farm,
yeah.
I think.
All my
Yeah.
subsequent courses were in the Pines. Um,
Okay. Yeah.
but it was the last day and a half, when he started speaking about vision, that like I can still feel the reverberation of my being. I mean, it felt like he was speaking to me. Uh,
Yeah, he had a way of doing that even with 120 students in class, right? And I had the same experience right before we walked into the sweat lodge. He he stared right through me and was talking to me as we went in. Probably the coldest sweat lodge I've ever been in because it's a sweat lodge for 100 and plus people, and it was cold. Spiritually, it was hot. I mean, the experience I had was pretty amazing. I don't think I slept that evening at all. And it was really saying, do I want to learn from this man? I walked that same farm that entire evening, just pondering the question, do I want to work with this man?
yeah, I went into the lodge and I was the furthest back row, um, near the door. And I remember weeping in there and having no idea why, what was happening. Um, I remember maybe 2 sentences that he said. I don't remember anything else. And I remember walking out of that lodge going, I have to find this. Um, and I have to discover what my vision is. And that question it's still deeply living in, I mean, it's become a journey. It's evolved. But that moment completely changed my life with Tom.
Yeah, obviously me as well. I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't made the choice to walk that part of the path.
Yeah. I mean, that's incredibly powerful. I'm curious, you shared that Tom didn't teach you necessarily how to teach it. And you yourself as a teacher with his Coyote teaching, and maybe you can speak about what Coyote teaching is, but what was the process like translating how he taught you into the curriculum that you bring?
Yeah. So, look, because everything that Stalking Wolf taught Tom was relational or really spiritual in origin. Okay, there was obviously physical skills, and other things. But primarily it's shifting from this dualistic, you know, physically based, mind based paradigm into a relational paradigm that everything is related to everything. Okay. As soon as you step into a relational paradigm, how you do it, the how and the relational are interlinked. They're not the same thing, but they're really quite interlinked. How you do it is important. So I remember that first Healing 2 class, I attempted to teach the way Tom would have taught or how Tom would have taught the class. From my perspective, it was the worst class I've ever taught. Okay. It wasn't me. It wasn't genuine. It wasn't how this was coming through me and my experiences. This was me trying to take the framework of Tom Brown and teach the way he would do it. And it was a flop from my perspective. The students have given me feedback that they loved the class, but I thought it was a flop. I didn't feel real. I didn't feel genuine. So I think we have 26 teachers at Wilderness Fusion. None of them teach the same way. Okay. No teacher at Wilderness Fusion teaches the same way. And that's the unique thing. It's relational, it's contextual. How do you teach? So here's the material. Here's the class we're teaching the material to. Every class is different, right? Like as an example, when you were in Healing 1, that was a unique class. We've never had a class like that. And in some ways, I hope we never have a class ever like that again. It was a really difficult class, right? There was just a handful of you in that class and a couple of characters who made it almost impossible to teach you the material, right? So it was our job as teachers to have you learn the material, even in that context, right? So that's what I teach the teachers at Wilderness Fusion. They can't do it like me because they're not me. They don't have my wounding. They don't have my experiences. They have their own stories. You know, how do they teach this their way? So every teacher at Wilderness Fusion teaches differently. Then my job as when I teach the teachers is how do we get it so that everything tastes the same, even if you're in two different Healing 1 classes and the material might have been delivered by two different teachers, as well as myself, but two different teachers. How do we get it so that it tastes the same? So if you think of your favorite restaurant, if every time you went back to have your favorite meal, it tasted different, you wouldn't go back, right? So there's a consistency in the flavor from Healing 1 all the way through Healing 7. You know, even when we do case with the case teachers, one case teacher is going to do case very differently than another case teacher, but they're going to have the same texture, the same taste to them, even though it's a very different person, very different framework for doing the same work. So, can I just say something about Coyote teaching? Coyote teaching is really, really misunderstood. Um, Often people say, Coyote teacher, you know, I'm going to trick you into something. And most of those people who play trickster, if you will, really don't know the material themselves. So they stand behind this guise of, well, I don't know, but I'm going to tell you, you haven't figured it out yet. Okay, this is my experience of a lot of people who say they're Coyote teaching, is they don't understand the material themselves, and they surely don't understand how it applies to you, Darren Silver, as an example, right? That is not Coyote teaching. That's not how Tom taught me. The teacher needs to really understand the student. And Coyote teaching is then the long game. It's what seed do I need to plant here when you first entered the school that you're only starting to capture today, 4 years later. Okay. That's Coyote teaching. That I'm teaching you something. You don't know that I'm teaching you something, but it's slowly sneaking into your awareness. And then you're like, oh, wow. And the beauty of Coyote teaching is then you don't attribute that to me. Okay. Now, the people who use Coyote teaching poorly, it's like, well, I know, but you don't know. And if you only knew what I knew, it would be better. Like, that's a ridiculous premise. What if I understand you so well, and by the way, it's hard when I first meet you, right? But over time, I know you so well. I know that if I do this little thing here, everything can shift. And where are you going to go with the material? It may not be exactly where I was going to take you anyway, right? You may do something much more important with the material than if I had taught it to you in a one-to-one basis. Okay. So that's coyote teaching from my perspective.
Yeah, beautiful, Carl. Beautifully said. Yeah, it feels like manipulation if a teacher that doesn't know coyote teaching is basically telling the student they don't know yet.
Yeah, and look, manipulation is an interesting thing because I mean, many people would say that Tom was quite manipulative. Okay, some people even say I'm manipulative. And what I always say is, if I tell you exactly what I'm doing, is it still manipulation? There's a piece in influence that we have to be really quite mindful about as teachers. Okay, so it's one of the things we teach when you get to Healing 7. Sorry about the phone going off. One of the things we teach in Healing 7 is something called the sphere of influence. And for us, it's called a baseline shift. It's a term that comes from tracking, that if you go from one baseline, let's say leaf litter onto grass, that's a baseline shift. You've changed the base that you're tracking on. Okay. So what you're going to find, because this came from an Apache culture, and this band of Apache were trackers, that most of the language here is a tracking based language. It's about as far as it goes with the Lipan Apache. There's nothing that really Tom taught or Wilderness Fusion teaches that was Lipan Apache. Okay. Even though Tom's teacher was Lipan Apache, as the myth goes, I don't know if you've heard the myth, Darren, but I'll tell the myth for all your listeners, which is in the late 1600s, there's this great character called Bear Man Dancing, right? And he goes swimming in the Pacific and he swims in the dark water. The water goes from bright blue to dark because of the depth of the ocean floor. And he comes back and they say he's possessed. And his wife, the chief of the tribe, okay, the Apache were a matriarchy. So the chief of the tribe, owl woman, knows her husband's not possessed, and that starts this whole journey of this small band of Apache saying, "Who are we without dogma or superstition, tradition and belief?" Right. So they knew that the dogma was what was going to kill the Native American. They were a very dogmatic culture, oftentimes. Right? So, you swim in dark water and you're possessed. It's a very dogmatic thing. And don't take that the wrong way. We live in a very dogmatic culture. Most religions are dogma based. I would tell you that our medical system is dogma based. Okay, there's a lot of dogma that's not has nothing to do with science, but it's dogmatic, and the way we do things is extremely dogmatic. So, yeah. So how do you step out of that and into what they call the simple truth, or what's real? And I don't know that we'll ever touch what's real. That's why it's called the simple truth. What is true? But what we teach and what Tom taught me is the more perspectives you can see something, the more likely it's true. If you can only see it from one perspective, is that truth? No. Right? And he would teach it differently. He would tell the story of, the hawk picking up that rabbit, and he saw it one way. His friend Rick saw it a different way, and they fought over it because they both saw the truth, but they only saw it from their perspective, right? So you take that and say, how do you start living multiple perspectives in your life? And, especially in a culture where we want things to be black and white, not relational. Everything's relating to everything. So So really going to join the circle of relationship. That's what we do as healers. So then you're going to join the circle. Nothing is one to one. You don't have this disease because of this event. Nothing is one to one. You start to have it to look at all the relations and everything affects everything. So how do you start to step into a framework that everything's everybody affects everything? That's what the beauty of that's been passed down for hundreds of years. That there's a sort of you got to step into that relation. So that's ultimately is you start to step into that relation. So that's ultimately what we teach. That's your next question.
When you talk about a tracking culture and baseline shifts, you know, in my year, particularly year 3 of Wilderness Fusion, and that's the year Tom made the journey to the great beyond and passed away. Um, I thought about pressure releases a lot. And for the listeners, pressure releases, how I would define it, are indications inside of the track that the one who left the track made um, about them from physical, emotional, spiritual, past, present, future. And when Tom passed, I couldn't help but thinking, how did he look at a track where there's 3 to 5,000 pressure releases, indications of the one who left the track, and not well, and maintain a perspective of non-judgment, because that's heavy to see that much in someone.
Well, interesting enough, I think, right. So one of the things we taught you, right, when you were in Healing 3 was when it's the relational, when you're observing something, you can either judge or you can witness. You can't do both at the same time, right? I can tell you how to get around that, but basically that's what we're teaching you in Healing 3. You can either judge or you can witness. So it's really important for the tracker to have that witness, right? It's a skill you have to teach is to have a witness. So the way we would describe that is when you step onto the earth, right? And the step is doing this beautiful motion, right? Is when you're stepping onto the earth is communicating back to you in signs and symbols, pressure releases, who you really are. But you can't read pressure releases looking for a one-to-one. You can't look for this pressure release in this part of the foot and think it has meaning. It doesn't. They're in relationship to each other. And it's not only on the inside of the track, it's on the track wall and it's outside of the track. When we teach presence psychology at Wilderness Fusion, we're talking about the pressure releases on the outside of the track or the relational pressure releases. But you can't even read those without that flow line or that center line in the center of the track, right? So everything is in context to everything else, which is what people want to forget, right? Everything is in context with everything else. Like there is no one-to-one relationship. So to be a tracker, you're always going to find what you're looking for, right? I mean, that's one of the things. Bill Marple, who just like Tom handed the healing portion of Stalking Wolf's teaching to me to bring out into the world, he handed to Bill Marple the tracking side, which Bill has a much harder job. He's following Tom up. I mean, Tom, it was at some juncture the authority on tracking in the United States. Okay. And, he passes this on to this man and Bill. And, Bill's job is difficult because tracking culture has changed tremendously since Tom was the lone wolf out there really teaching tracking way back in the day. So, we have these African trackers and this teaching from Africa coming into tracking. And John Young, a big part of that also, Tom's first student, John Young, going to to learn from the Africans, etc. I mean, what incredible influence John has had in the world of tracking, right? So he even brings back these tests, etc. But it's a very different tracking framework where you're looking for sign, meaning that you're looking for the track itself. Okay, so Pat, my wife Pat, and I were recently in Africa, and I'm watching the tracker on the front of that safari vehicle, right? Incredible. We're going 30 miles an hour. They're focused on a 1 foot track on the edge of the road, and they ignore a track if it's more than 3 hours old. Okay. They're sign tracking. They're looking for this is a lion track. And they're doing it at 35 miles an hour. Don't think they don't have skill. Okay. It's less than 3 hours old. It's worth pursuing. Let's go pursue this lion. Pretty amazing. Okay. That is not the tracking system that Tom handed down to us. Here, you can read, like you were saying, almost anything in the track. So if you want to see it the last time the person you're tracking went to the bathroom, it's in the track, right? We're teaching people in a weekend in our psychology classes how to read the track and read someone's psychology with pitch, stride, and straddle. You're looking at pitch, stride, and straddle primarily. You're not even looking at the pressure releases yet. And from those things, you're quickly learning in a weekend, which is amazing. Some of these people have never tracked before, to come up with someone's psychology, right? And we put them through a great test. Is we have the person walk through the tracking box. They haven't met them. They look at the track. We ask them what's their psychology, and then we let them meet the person and let them ask them questions. So it's pretty amazing how quickly they can accurately, read someone's psychology in a track. Okay, so I don't want to say more sophisticated, because let me tell you that those sign trackers who are, what they can do is amazing, but that's not the relational system that Tom passed down. Okay, so Bill's job is even harder than mine because tracking isn't as sexy as healing, if you will. Now, I'm not sure that that's true. In some ways, tracking could be sexier than healing, because when you're a healer, you're working with people who in generally are pretty ill, and it's not the fun, sexy job that you go to every day. So, yeah, we're yeah, we live in an interesting culture where these ancient skills aren't understood, and people want to know what's in it for them. You're probably not getting into the healing arts if you want to know what's in it for you, if that makes any sense. Yeah, cool. Yeah. Um, and, Tom would send Bill out on the hottest of days, to look at tracks and just kill him. I didn't go through that. Bill had it harder than I did.
Well, you know, I've often played things out in my head like, wow, I really want to learn something. And if I asked Tom, what would his response be to me? Um, and usually I'm led to something excruciatingly difficult or terrifying or rigorous. Um, and yeah, uh, so I want to pull a little bit away.
Look, you know, it, you just have to remember the way Tom was taught by Stalking Wolf, right? Which was, Stalking Wolf didn't hand anything to Tom, right? He put him through hell, literally. Um, the other day I had this experience in class. A student asked me a question, and I knew she hadn't done any dirt time, but it was a great question, right? And I knew if I answered it, she really wouldn't understand it, right? And I actually said to her, I said, I'm not sure that I want to answer this question. Not because you don't deserve an answer, just because you may not understand it and it's not what I went through, right? So at that point I used the word trauma, right? As I said, Tom was smart enough to create a little bit of trauma in everything we taught. Now I've backed off of that because in our culture we overuse trauma. If you don't get lunch today, it's traumatic. Like, I'm not sure that that's traumatic, okay? But the word I'm using now is one of Tom's words, which is dissonance, which is also, it means the same thing in music as it does in the context we're using it here, which is if I don't create a certain amount of dissonance in the teaching, will you understand it? Right? So if it's just handed to you, you will quickly forget. And I do hand people things all the time, and I teach it to them again and again and again. Okay, but if you throw in just a little bit of dissonance, they actually remember it. So why is this? What is it about the way we're wired that we need that contradiction to actually learn? So, even going back to Coyote teacher, it's how little dissonance can I use and you'll still hear it, right? Because I can use a lot of dissonance, and often I do in class. If a character needs big dissonance, I can use big dissonance, okay? But the more subtle it is, the better, right? But that takes time to understand the person that you're teaching, right? Cool. So it's that art of teaching, which is how do I have, if you're in a class of what, 15, 12, 15, I think is your current Healing 4 class, something like that. With those 12 or 14 students, I have to teach you differently than I teach a different character in that class, right? Because your dissonance is different than everybody else's. So, so how do you do that well? Because it's not always words. How do you do that well with each person? That's the art of teaching.
Beautiful. I love that, Carl. Um, and I'm curious in moving a little bit towards I'm just going to frame it like the art of healing. How would you define healing? And what wilderness fusion does, not only for students, but more so for clients and clients of students.
Right. So here's the simple definition of a healer. He, she, they, who can make contact and change your perspective or perception. That's a healer. Okay. So you don't necessarily have to be a hands-on healer to be a healer, right? When you're doing your vision quest work, as an example, you're a teacher, but you're also holding vision quest. You're also a healer, right? Because you're making contact with your students, meaning you're having a dialogue. I mean, that's key because a lot of healing modalities, I'll just use healing modalities, are a monologue. It's here's what the healer's doing to the client. Okay. Even our modern day medicine often is a monologue. Okay. Here's what the doctor is going to do to you from these test results, right? So it's a dialogue. I do this, it comes back, and we start to have a dialogue. Okay. That creates context that starts to create relational. And then the contact isn't necessarily touch. It could be your eyes. It could be your voice. It could be your presence is touching the person, right? But it involves that touch, that contact, right? And then you change their perception. Now, here's what I know as a healer is that our physicality is extremely fluid, right? In this moment, you have cancer, and the next moment, you don't. That doesn't make sense to our minds. Okay. But if you change your perspective, right, the cancer doesn't have the landscape to survive, right? That's far out for many people. Okay. But, you're talking about the art of healing. There's also the science of healing, right? Which is where I'm, so my favorite organ is the liver. The liver does about 20,000 different things. Okay. How do you start talking to the liver? You're not going to use words. You're not just going to use energy. Okay. You actually have to learn how to speak chemistry, right? What does chemical feel like? The liver will respond to chemistry, right? So it's my favorite organ because you can shift someone's perception really fast by changing their chemistry, and not just changing their chemistry, but that changes almost everything, right? So how do you step into the liver, right? How do you step into someone's paradigm, make the smallest change? They have to go around you, and that changes their perception of the world, and everything is different. And then they don't even equate that healing to you because they found a different perception, right? We don't want to be heroes as healers. We want to lead people so that they can find a new perception that's going to change everything. And then that landscape that allowed cancer to be there isn't there anymore. It just doesn't appear one day that we have cancer. You've created an environment that the symptom, if you will, is the cancer. The symptom is that the cancer now can grow. Change the environment, the cancer really can't be there anymore. So, and we should be looking at that from a scientific perspective. I just don't want that to be new dogma. Remember, we're trying to remove dogma and superstition. I don't want that to be the new dogma, right? So what I looked for in my healing practice, as an example, was someone who had multiple personality, or they actually call it, I can't think of the name right now. So in personality A, she had MS. In personality B, she didn't have MS. Say it again,
Schizophrenia,
Darren.
bipolar.
I think it's called DID,
Oh,
multiple. No, no, you're into a different realm. But literally two different personalities. Your personality A, and then your personality B. You're not just depressed and then you're manic, bipolar. Okay, you're literally personality A, and then the next minute you're personality B. So with this woman, personality A, she had MS. Personality B, no MS, no signs of MS. So I say to her doctor, have you taken an MRI to see if she really doesn't have MS, or is it just that it doesn't affect her? And he goes, well, of course she has MS. And I said, no, see, you're making an assumption. You can't make those assumptions. We make too many assumptions. What if we actually took a scan of her brain and there were no nodes? Does she have MS as personality B? Are we that fluid? I would argue that we are. Okay, but I don't want you to believe me. I want you to have that experience. Because if I just say it, it's dogma. And as we know, anybody can say anything today and say it's real. That's not real. Okay, you have to have this an experience over and over and over again to have it be real. And that doesn't even mean it's real. It means this is your inroad into it, but is that real? Right. This is the job of a healer, to see it relationally. So even if you have a disease and your friend has the same disease, you might have gotten there on two different routes. So I can't use what works for you with him. I can promise you I can't. Right? It's relational. Right? So at what point in time are we going to start to step into quantum medicine or relational medicine, that everything is relational to that client? They're starting to do it with drugs. With this drug, it cures you, or it can kill you, or it has no effect. Right? They know this about medicines. The same medicine can hurt one person, help somebody, and do nothing for the third person, right? So can we start to shift even the medicine that we work with so it's contextual to you? So that's exciting to me. That's a world I want to live in. Okay. Look, this last year, Pat and I went to this incredible lecture by a man named Gil Hedley. If you don't know Gil Hedley, you should look him up. He's an anatomist. He does an incredible job. Okay, he did something called the Nerve Tour, and we took his Nerve Tour both here in Asheville, and he did, I think, 100 city tour with the Nerve Tour, and then we took it online again. And he was dissecting this man, his friend, and what he said, it was his amazing is, as I'm dissecting this man, I find things that shouldn't be there, pieces of the nervous system that aren't in any of the books. And what I love, because it's all Latin, right? Anatomy. He said, when we got to the nerves around the pelvis, they're all called, if you translate the Latin, they're called the shame nerves. So he just changed the Latin to be the pleasure nerves, right? Because he said Giuseppe just didn't understand the context we live in today, right? They were the shame nerves, right? But if you name something shame versus pleasure, right? Look at what that context creates, right? So what if we actually, I have this dream one day that we'll do something called the Anatomy Project, and that we'll take all these practitioners from different perspectives, and we'll say, well, how do you see this? And where we see things similarly, perhaps different, perhaps that's real. And maybe we can rename our anatomy so we have an inroad to it so you could actually teach a child in grammar school about their body so they understand it versus just something that happens to them, right? Wouldn't that be amazing if it was actually approachable, and that we understood the dynamic of exercise and diet and all these things and how they come together? So, like, I think as a culture, if we would, do the Anatomy Project, we could live in a different world. So that's one of my visions, if you will, is how do we do that? One of the things that I loved about Gil's talk was I felt like I was in this alone. And then I realized he was doing the exact same thing that we were. And then one of our students who also took the Nerve Tour sent me this piece where in one of Gil's podcasts, he's talking about Tom Brown. He couldn't remember his name. He said, yeah, it's this tracker dude who lives in New Jersey, right? And and he's even using tracking in his Nerve Tour. He's got this acorn that he's put across the ground, and he said, what's this a track of? And people are like, bicycle track, et cetera, et cetera. And it's an acorn. But what is our body but of a track of all of the events, all the things that have happened to us, right? So, people who work with fascia, people who work with the body understand this, right? So how do we start to step into that world, right? That excites me. I mean, that I could stay up for, days working on how do we put this together differently. So all this passed down from one crazy guy in New Jersey, right?
Well, it certainly lights me up. Um, Hearing this just totally lights me up, and it's more for listeners than for me or people at a particular juncture in their healing. There's this voice in my head that says, "Yeah, but Karl, it's genetic. I have a particular gene that's predisposing me to um, prostate cancer or breast cancer or." Um, and what I'm curious about in the question here is what I hear you saying is, hey, our body is fluid, um, and it can change. So, what is the journey like that you've experienced of people going from this very fixed belief of themselves to actually changing the belief, and therefore, I mean, you're kind of already answering it. I'm just making it a little bit more explicit.
Yeah. So I think there's several things there. Okay. Um, First, it's one of the things that we taught you in Healing 3. Okay. Which is that if you have an addiction, right now I'm equating health issues to addiction, but just let's just say an addiction is a belief. Okay, they're very similar here. It's an addiction and a belief. If you have a belief, you're going to see everything the same way. Okay, if you have an addiction to chocolate, you're always going to be seeking out chocolate, right? So it's a similar path. It's different, but it's similar. Okay, yeah, I know it's edgy, right? So so often they say with people who have addictions is if you hit bottom, you'll shift the addiction. I know that not to be true. There are plenty of people who hit bottom and don't shift a thing. Okay. In my experience, in our experience in doing this for 15 years at Wilderness Fusion with many, many clients coming in to be worked on by the healers. Okay. When people are sick of their behavior or sick of what their behavior does to others, they will change their behavior. Okay. So I know you're not going to change your behavior until you're sick of it. Okay. I've been a workaholic almost my entire life. Okay. And I can justify it just like any addiction is I'm doing it for everybody else. Okay. But it also feeds me. I love what I do. Right. So I'm not going to change that behavior until I'm sick of it. Now that I'm 60, almost 61, I'm starting getting sick of my behavior. Right. Because I don't have to ask the question the same way. The question usually is, what do I need to do to change this? Now I'm getting a little smarter as I'm in my 60s. I'll ask the question is, what do we need to do to change this so that I'm not the only one who has to do the work? Okay. What you're going to find as a healer is it's not about you doing the work. It's how do you turn this back to the client and work and awareness are pretty much again these parallel paths. If you ask enough questions, you'll have awareness, right? So the work is how do you ask the questions? So what questions do you need to ask about your life so that you'll shift the paradigm of your own life? Okay. So what we're teaching people is here are the tools. You may use this tool, somebody else may use that tool, somebody else may use this tool. They're tools to get you there, right? So, what tools can we give you so that you can change your entire life? And do you want to change it? Many people don't want to change their lives. We can't teach them anything, right? So, and that's okay. When you're ready to shift your life, when you're ready to change it, when you're sick of your behavior or what it does to others, you'll seek something out to change that. That's the beauty of this. But if you're not sick of yourself, you won't do it. Yeah. So you were talking about DNA. Okay. Yeah, that's an aspect of what we do. It's one piece in the relational, right? You could also say I grew up in a household where the paradigm was this, so I learned to do things this way. It's not necessarily DNA, but it's definitely being passed on in the family. There's plenty of incredible family work going on so that you can start to see the patterns of your family and how it gets passed on. Perhaps that's DNA, but perhaps that's just behavior, right? That this is the way you do it. So, how do you bring all these things together relationally to say, even though you're predisposed to prostate cancer and your friend is, why do you have it and he doesn't? Right? It's not just the DNA, it's your behavior. How often do you sit? Right? All these things. Like, if a man is old enough, he's probably going to have prostate cancer in this culture. In this culture, because we sit so much, right? So, how do you keep things moving? Right? That's not really a question that's asked if you go to the doctor and you have prostate cancer, right? So, so how do we bring all these incredible things together today that are here, but we don't accept them, right? So, that's our job as healers, is to bring these things together for the client so they can live a different life. Or even better yet, hand them the tools so they can go find it themselves.
Hmm. Yeah. There's a lot there that I get really curious about, and it's the power of questions. Um, Questions related to having the capacity to hold different perspectives. And when I think about working with someone, whether it's in the context of Vision Quest, which is a lot of what I do, or in healing, there's this ability for the guide or healer to, and I want kind of clarity on this. Is it walking into their landscape to see their current perspective and find the question that pulls them somewhere else? And what does that require of us to not ask questions that are rooted in our own, um, uh, what's the word I'm looking for?
Right. Look, I mean, you're asking several incredible questions. Okay, so let me answer, and let me answer in this order. Okay, first of all, is yes, we have to walk a few steps in our client or our student's shoes to see how they perceive, right? But it's also, something I've been teaching about this month. Actually, this month is Dead Space Month at Wilderness Fusion. Is you start to see the dead space or the things that are not communicating to them. So they have holes in their reality. So something that is taught in our body work program, as an example, the body is really quite important, where we include the body in what we're teaching at Wilderness Fusion. It's really quite important. It's a body-based, place-based, earth-based paradigm philosophy. All right. So your body is an important part of that. So what Pat, my wife again, is teaching in body work is, are you asking the what questions? Has to do with the primal, often the past, what happened here, how did this happen, the relational or the present moment, how this happened. And by the way, these aren't one to one, so just, all these things happen everywhere, but predominantly. Or why, vision based, right? Why? That why question, the elusive why question. There's not one answer to a why question, but why. And why sets off intent, which hopefully brings all those things together so that you're living in what we call the now, right? So it's your past, or all the preparation to this moment, the present moment, and your vision, what you would think of as the future. Interesting enough, in this philosophy that we teach, that Tom passed on, there is no past or future. There's just preparation and vision. What are you moving towards as your vision? Okay. So, can you start asking questions from the now? You can't do that. So, if you're looking at a client's or a student's dead space, you'll start to realize that they don't ask the how or the why question, just the what question, right? So, it's not hard then to step in to ask the question that they didn't ask. And if you don't think that's going to change your perception, right, like then you haven't worked with anybody. Like as soon as you ask a question differently, which is my only job, is to ask the question that you didn't ask, right? So when we do something called Q and Q at Wilderness Fusion, right? Q and Q is just you ask a question, I answer it with a question, but I'm handing you the question you didn't think to ask, and it's usually where the aha moments come from, right? So so how do you balance all those things together so that you can see your students' paradigm? Yeah, you have to walk a step in their shoes, see their dead space, see how they perceive, and then just ask the questions they didn't ask. Everything starts to shift. Look, there's a reason it's called the simple truth. If it's simple, it's really real. If we start making it complicated, well, then it's just complicated. It's really that simple. Now, doing it may not be simple. Getting yourself there, I can tell you, is never going to be easy. I often say to the new students, what do you think my biggest job is at Wilderness Fusion? And they have all kinds of answers. But the reality is, here's what my biggest job is to have you feel as safe as you possibly can, because you won't do this work unless you feel safe. And then have you feel as uncomfortable as I can make you, because you're not going to learn anything if you're comfortable, right? Is this a path for everybody? I can promise you it's not, okay? Often people don't want to see the uncomfortable things about their own life and their own patterns and what they've created, right? Then it goes to your other question, which is, are we projecting our values onto our clients, right? What we say at Wilderness Fusion is a healer who doesn't understand themselves is going to project those things, and they're potentially dangerous. All right, so I often tell this story. About a decade ago, maybe more, I had a client who came to me, and she was in her late 70s, and she had ovarian cancer, and her daughter sent her, right? So her daughter sent her to me, and I was just like, oh, let's see how this goes. So the first question I always ask is, why are you here? And she kind of looked at me, and she didn't have an answer. And I said, are you here because of the ovarian cancer? And she goes, oh, no, that's going to kill me. It had already jumped her diaphragm, the ovarian cancer. Okay, so it had already spread and was past her diaphragm and into her lungs. Eventually, she was going to drown. Okay, so I said, okay, are you here to make the transition from the physical into something else? And she goes, oh no, I'm all set there. And I said, so why are you here? And she had lymphedema, which makes sense. Her lymph system was gone. Her legs had blown up to be double to triple the size. So in a couple sessions, we removed the water from her legs. Okay. Now, by the way, that's somewhat miraculous because she didn't have a lymph system. And a few weeks later, I had heard from her daughter. Her daughter wanted to have a meeting with me. And I was like, oh no, like now I'm going to hear this is my stuff, right? This is what I project onto something. I thought for sure the daughter was coming to me to say, you didn't help my mother, she died. Instead, when she met with me, she said, thank you. And I said, for what? I didn't do anything. And she said, oh, you don't understand, do you? And I said, obviously I don't. I've done this long enough. Been doing this for 35 years. I've learned to listen, right? I said, so obviously, no, I don't know what happened. Please tell me. And she said, my mother was of a generation where if her legs looked good, she knew she had the world by the huevos. Okay. Now, by the way, I still don't agree with that statement, but I heard what she had to say. So her mother died at peace because her legs were of normal size. Okay. That is truly not my paradigm of something that I would ever even consider to ask a question of that nature. Right? I asked the questions I thought. Do you want to work on the cancer? She didn't think that was possible. That's going to kill her. She was a spiritual woman. She didn't need help there. Right? I would never have asked that question. And who knows? Well, I'll take her daughter's word for it. That changed the way she died. Was that a healing? Absolutely. Right? I still have a hard time with it, which is why I tell the story, because there's so much contradiction in it. That's not the way I would have approached it ever. Okay. So, if you think you know what the client wants, you probably should take your hand, that versus the client knows. You probably should take your hands off the client. Please listen to your clients. I mean, remember everything that we teach here is what, was stalking wealth passed on to Tom, passed on to me, is the philosophy of choice. Are you taking away someone's choice? Is something I ask constantly. Constantly. All right. One more story, Darren, and we'll call it a day. Does that sound okay? Cool. So here's the story. We had a student sign up for Healing One, and a couple of weeks later, our registrar called me and said he needs to see you for a healing right away. He now has pancreatic cancer. On my drive to see him over to our campus, I'm asking this question. I'm not going to put my hands on this man unless I think I can shift the pancreatic cancer. From a medical perspective, pancreatic cancer is basically a death certificate, right? So, can I actually do something for this man? Okay, so that's the drive over to our campus. I meet him here, there. He can barely walk. And I ask him this one question: do you want to live? His answer was, I don't want to die. Okay, because it's me. I said to him, that's not good enough. I can't work with that. Okay. The last time I saw him 6 months later, I asked him the same question: do you want to live? His answer was, I've come to the unfortunate conclusion that I'm going to live. The next day, he found out he no longer had pancreatic cancer. 2 days after that, he died. The question I keep asking now, all these years later, is, was that a healing? Was that a success? Right? He chose, from my perspective now, after pondering this for years, he wanted to die. He chose it consciously. He was also starving, and there was a reality to that. But if he had had the will to really want to live, I believe he could have done it at that moment. However, he had come to the unfortunate conclusion that he was going to live. So, if we project onto the situation what we want the outcome to be, it never works out. But can you also step out of a reality can you step into a reality that the client can't see? So it's and both. It's that paradox, right? So that's what we do here. That's what I've devoted my life to, is how do we create this and how do we change people's perspectives?
Real simple question. Um, would you call that moment of shifting perspectives initiatory for people, an initiation of sorts?
Potentially, potentially, Darren. I mean, so initiation. What's initiation? It's kind of a lost art these days. Initiation. For us, because we work in a paradigm of removing the dogmatic and the patterns of things, right? So we're not going to give ourselves that doorway to walk into. We need a different doorway. For us, an initiation means that you've transcended something. It's equated to transcendence. Okay. And so what does that mean? That's a big word that's used in many, many ways in different cultures. But for us, can you transcend the path that got you here? Okay. Like, you've walked this path, here you are. Can you choose a different path without this initiation? Right. And that can happen in many ways. A vision quest can be a transcendent experience that, wow, until now, and now I'm choosing a different path without some of this baggage, or however you want to see it, right? Can you transcend what got you here? So that doorway, that transcendent doorway is initiation. All religions have some sort of doorways into them so that you can step into that truth. They all have them. If they didn't have those doorways, they wouldn't be successful, because people realize that, oh, I walked through this doorway and I've shifted. So all religions have those doorways, right? That the issue I have is that often they confuse the doorway for the experience of walking through it. That made sense, right? They're using their dogma to say this is the doorway, right? There's many doorways. So they just confuse the doorway with the experience itself. Um, we're more we're more concerned that you have the experience than you say this is how I did it, right? How you got to that doorway, only you know the path that got you there. That you chose to step through, that's the transcendence, not the doorway itself. That you chose to do it, that's the key, right? That's the key for anybody who's leading initiation is how do you remove the friction? They couldn't do it up till now. Why now? How did you grease the rails of friction so they actually would walk through this time? Why was it so compelling this time that they got over the inertia or the friction to walk through, right? That's again the art of initiation or vision quest or healing, or you pick the path. It doesn't matter the doorway, but will they walk through?
Awesome. Thank you, Carl. And lastly, where can people find out more about Wilderness Fusion?
Yeah, pretty simple. Wildernessfusion.com. Um, Come to our website, and there's a lot of stuff there. You know, we teach so many programs and so many things. Truthfully, you're only seeing about half the website when you enter it. Once you become a student and you log in, and a whole world unfolds for you. But you're coming for one of three reasons. Either you want to be a client, you want to be healed by one of our healers. We have 12, I think 12 clinics throughout the country, plus the clinics associated with Healing 5, 6, and 7, where we're working with cancer, autoimmune disease, and heart disease in those clinics specifically, because the students are working with people who have the disease they're learning about. Or we have clinics throughout the country where you can go, hopefully locally, and see some pretty incredible healers that have either finished the program or are still students here. So that's the client side. You can just come to Wilderness Fusion to increase your awareness. And then you're going to go through healing 1 through 4, where you're basically learning about yourself so that you really understand yourself. Healing 5, 6, and 7, bodywork 3. We also have a 2-year bodywork program, a 3-year bodywork program. But again, that 3rd year of bodywork, you're working on clients. So you can step into those. We have online classes. So there's many ways to step into Wilderness Fusion. How do you learn? What are you looking for? We probably have a way of meeting you. Just be curious. Don't think we're just going to hand you the information as soon as you walk to the website. Cool.
Awesome, Carl. Well, this is just such a riveting conversation. And really grateful that you've taken this time, and encourage all the listeners to please check out Wilderness Fusion, and check out the website. It's absolutely changed my life in dramatic ways, and certainly made me a better Vision Quest guide, in ways that I absolutely could not see stepping into year 1 or even year 2. and probably most of year 3. So, yeah, awesome. Thanks again, Karl.